Everyone there knew. When a man is about to die, the whole prison changes temperature. Elias arrived in handcuffs, his ankle chains scraping the ground as if each step were a stamp saying, "It's over." He didn't look to the sides because there were no more sides. Only the straight line to the end existed. At the front, Captain Moreira walked as if carrying a package. Hard face, hand near the keys, dry gaze. The kind of man who doesn't need to hate a convict. He just needs to serve his sentence. "Come on," he said softly. "Don't complicate things, for your mother's sake." Elias swallowed, not out of respect, out of control. If he opened his mouth, he would either beg or explode, because everyone there repeated the same story like a prayer. Elijah killed Sophia, the girl from the flower shop. But Elias knew something that nobody wanted to hear. He hadn't killed anyone. And the worst part wasn't dying innocent. The worst part was dying with the truth stuck in my throat, while the real culprits slept peacefully. The chains rattled harder as he rounded the last bend in the hallway. The air grew colder. The smell of disinfectant intensified. And then he saw the door that no one goes through and comes back the same. Moreira stopped, put the key in the lock, and the metal made a clack that cut the world in two. At that moment, Elias felt his chest tighten, not from fear of the end, but from anger over a detail that had never left his mind. Sophia had a flower in her hair the day she died. Elias remembered this because he had seen her alive that day, for a few seconds before everything turned into a nightmare. And nobody, absolutely nobody, wanted to talk about the one detail that could change everything. The flower shop's camera was working. He had said that at the trial. They laughed. They said there was no recording. They said the camera didn't save. They said it was a murderer's excuse. But at that moment, with the key turning, Moreira did something minimal, almost invisible. He ran his hand over the inside pocket of his vest, as if to confirm that something was there. And Elijah saw. He saw a hidden piece of black plastic, almost sticking out. A USB flash drive. His heart stopped. Because he recognized the white label stuck there, written crookedly in blue pen, as if it had been done in a hurry. Floriculture, 22 and 13. Elias stopped breathing for half a second. "Where did you get that from?" The voice came out low, but sharp. Moreira froze, just for a moment, a single moment of human error. "Shut up and walk." Elijah did not walk, because in that second, he understood something that hurt more than the sentence. The evidence existed, and someone hid it. Moreira took a step back, pressing himself against Elias's body, speaking in his ear without raising his voice. "Do you want to die with dignity, or do you want to die screaming?" Elias looked at his face for the first time. Red, tired eyes, but not tired from work, tired of keeping a secret. "You're carrying my life in your pocket," Elias whispered. "You know that." Moreira clenched his jaw. And before he could answer, a radio crackled from the opposite side of the hallway. A short hiss, a nervous voice. "Captain, stop everything, now!" Moreira turned around immediately. "Repeat." The voice came again, louder, more urgent, as if it were running along with the words, "Order from management! Execution suspended! We have new material, I repeat, execution suspended!" The world stood still. Elias blinked as if he hadn't understood the language. Moreira stood motionless, key in hand, and the flash drive, still somewhat visible in my pocket, felt as heavy as a brick. "No," Elias whispered. "It can't be." Moreira did not respond, because he also knew it wasn't a miracle. It was the truth finally slipping out. And in that hallway, at that exact second, Elias realized what no one dared to say aloud. If the execution was suspended, someone outside opened the file. What if someone opened the file? Someone was going to fall. They turned the corner, the green corridor. That's where the smell changed. The musty, disinfectant smell of the cell block gave way to the smell of cold metal and, strangely, wet earth. They were entering the execution yard. The courtyard was small, surrounded by high, dark brick walls. In the center, the structure, a simple table, an armrest, and leather straps. It looked like a doctor's office from an old movie, too clean but with a terrible purpose. 8 people were already waiting. The prison director, Mr. Costa, sweating even in the morning chill, he was ultimately responsible. The priest, with his Bible open, murmuring words that Elias couldn't hear. The doctor, in his white coat, with a stethoscope hanging around his neck, there only to confirm the end. And the 4 journalists, notebooks in hand, ready to turn a man's death into a front-page headline. Moreira stopped Elias right in the middle of the courtyard, near the table. 10 minutes, Elias. That's all the protocol gives us. 10 minutes for goodbye. Elias looked at the sky. It was grey, without sun. He thought it was a good day to leave. He wouldn't miss that sky. He closed his eyes. The priest approached, his voice soft. My son, do you have something to confess? Something to ease your heart before you meet the Creator? Elias opened his eyes and looked directly at the priest. Father, I've already said what I had to say. I didn't kill Sophia. And if I'm going to die for a crime I didn't commit, may my blood not be the end, but the beginning of something. The priest sighed sadly. He had heard this story many times before. Innocent or guilty, they all said the same thing in the end. Moreira stepped forward, ready to begin the mooring procedures. Director Costa glanced at his wristwatch. 6 o'clock and 1 minute. The deadline was 6:11. It was at that moment that the silence, which was the most important thing in that place, was broken. It wasn't a scream, nor the sound of a car. It was a bark. A hoarse, unexpected bark, followed by the sound of paws scratching on the cement. They all froze. A dog. It wasn't a police dog, trained and imposing. It was a skinny mongrel, with brown fur and floppy ears, looking like it had come from a street fight. It entered the yard as if it were the most normal place in the world, running in zigzags, its tail down, but its eyes shining with curiosity. The panic started quietly, with the whispers of the guards. What is this? Where did it come from? Close the gate. Who left it open? Director Costa turned purple. A security breach at the time of the execution was any prison director's nightmare. He gestured frantically to 2 guards. Get that thing out of here! Now! The stray dog, ignoring the pandemonium, ran toward the center of the courtyard, where Elias was standing. The dog stopped a few meters from the condemned man, sniffing the ground with a strange intensity. Elias, who was ready to accept the end, looked at the dog. It was the first living, spontaneous thing he had seen in years. He gave a weak smile. Hello, friend. It seems you've taken the wrong turn. The dog, however, wasn't interested in Elias. He was interested in the ground. He began sniffing urgently, moving his snout rapidly, and then he started digging. It wasn't a playful dig. It was a desperate excavation, right next to the small drainage grate that was less than a meter from the execution table. The guards approached, attempting to lasso the animal. Get out of here, you stinking creature! But the mongrel was quick. With a final tug, he managed to tear a piece off the drainage grate, exposing the dark hole below. And then he stopped digging. He sniffed the hole, let out a sharp bark, different from his previous barks, and pulled something out. It was small, metallic, and shone dimly in the dim morning light. The dog dropped the object at Elias's feet and took a step back, looking at Elias as if to say, Look, it's here. Everything stopped. Time, which had 10 minutes, froze. Captain Moreira, who was about to restrain Elias, looked at the ground, then at the object. Elias also looked, and the blood ran cold in his veins, but not from fear of death, from fear of the truth that was being unearthed. The object was a small, crumpled silver medallion with a broken chain. It wasn't just any medallion. It was the pendant that Sophia, the victim, was wearing on the day she was last seen. The medallion that the police never found. The medallion that, according to investigators, had been taken by the murderer. Elias felt an electric shock run through his body. He leaned over, ignoring Moreira's silent protest, and picked up the medallion. It was cold and dirty with mud and some kind of dark substance. He turned the pendant over in his hand. On the back, amateurishly engraved, were the initials S.M. Sofia Machado. Director Costa, seeing the scene, shouted, not in anger, but in despair. What is this? Elias, drop it! Guards, grab the dog and the object! But it was too late. Elias held the evidence that could have saved him 3 years ago, the evidence that was hidden less than 5 meters from where he was to be executed. He raised his arm, the medallion dangling between his thumb and forefinger, and his voice, normally low and resigned, came out strong, cutting through the air like a whip. Don't touch me! Look at this! You thought I stole it! You thought I threw it in the river! But it was here. Hidden. Captain Moreira, for the first time in his career, hesitated. He looked at the medallion, then at the hole in the drainage grate, and finally at Director Costa, whose face was as white as paper. Director Costa, we need to isolate the area. This isn't normal. Costa was shaking his head, trying to regain control of the crumbling situation. No, the protocol! Elias, time's up! Time's not up, Director. Elias's voice was pure fury and curiously hope. Time has begun now. I'm not Sophia's killer. The killer knew this was the last place anyone would look, and he knew I would die before that was found. The dog, who had been the catalyst for all the chaos, sat calmly beside Elias, observing the commotion with the composure of someone who has just solved a complex problem. The doctor, the priest, and the journalists stepped forward, all wanting to see the object, all realizing that the story of the execution had ended, and the story of a possible miscarriage of justice was beginning. Moreira, with a gesture of his hand, prevented the journalists from getting close. He knew that if that medallion was real, if it really was Sophia's lost object, the execution could not continue. The system could not afford to kill a man at the exact moment when crucial new evidence appeared. Director, I can't proceed, Moreira said, breaking protocol for the first time. I need a direct order to ignore this. Director Costa picked up the radio phone, his hands trembling. He had to call the governor's office. The decision to suspend an execution was the most difficult he could make. Calling the cabinet. We have a security situation, a breach in the yard, and evidence. While Costa tried to speak with the capital, Elias stared at the medallion in his hand. He could smell the earth and the rust. He could feel the presence of Sophia, the victim, and he realized how close he had come to the end. 10 minutes. Only 10 minutes remained before the truth would be buried forever, ironically, just inches from where he stood. He looked at the hole in the fence. It wasn't a random hiding place. It was a drain where rainwater ran off, where trash accumulated. A place that would only be disturbed if there was a deep clean or very specific maintenance, or if someone knew exactly where to look. Elias knelt down slowly, ignoring Captain Moreira, who was now paralyzed. He placed his hand in the hole, examining the inside with his fingers. It was damp and smelly. It wasn't the dog that brought him here, Captain, Elias murmured, his voice low but intense. The dog dug him up, but someone put him here, and it wasn't today. Judging by the dirt, it's been a while. He withdrew his hand and showed it. It was covered in mud, but he pointed to the side of the opening. Look here. There's a scratch. As if someone had used a tool to wedge the medallion deep into the side of the pipe, so that it wouldn't be carried away by the water, but also so that it wouldn't be seen. Moreira approached, his professional curiosity overcoming protocol. He knelt beside Elias, examining the hole. It's too narrow for a human hand. But not for a stick or a long, thin hook, Elias replied. Someone had access to this area, someone who knew the medallion was missing, and someone who wanted to make sure I was the culprit and that the evidence remained here, a step away from my death. Director Costa finally came to his senses. He turned off the radio, his voice choked with emotion. The governor has suspended the execution, temporarily suspended. The courtyard is cordoned off. No one touches anything. Elias, you return to the observation cell. Guards, restrain the dog somewhere safe. It is now evidence. Elias smiled. A genuine smile after years of despair. The dog, call him Shadow. He just gave me 10 more minutes of life, and the chance to prove the truth. Captain Moreira, still bewildered, grabbed some yellow tape and began to cordon off the area. The execution scene instantly transformed into a crime scene. But the big question hung in the air. If Elias was innocent, who was the real killer? And more importantly, who, within the maximum security walls of the prison, had the audacity and access to plant the final piece of evidence, just meters from the execution site, ensuring it would only be discovered at the last moment? The investigation began right there, on the cold cement of the courtyard, with a stray dog named Sombra and a dirty silver medallion. The first step would be to find out who had access to that drainage area, and why. The execution yard was located next to the maintenance wing, where the employees' lockers and tool storage were kept. It was a constantly busy area, but only for authorized personnel. Director Costa, now with his career in jeopardy, called in the head of internal security, Lieutenant Rodriguez, a man known for his unwavering loyalty and zero imagination. Rodriguez, I want a list of everyone who has been in the maintenance area or who has had access to the master key for the side gate in the last 48 hours. And check the cameras. Cameras? Director, the cameras in the maintenance wing have been out of service for a week. That's what Sergeant Ramos told me. Costa closed his eyes. Of course they were. There was always a loophole in the system. Ramos, bring Ramos here, now. Meanwhile, Elias was being led back to the green corridor. He was no longer dragging his feet. He walked with a new energy, the adrenaline of hope. He was still chained, but now he had a weapon. Sophia's medallion, wrapped in a tissue and in the custody of Captain Moreira, who was overseeing the collection of evidence. Moreira, walking alongside Elias, broke the silence. Elias, if this is a fraud. No, Captain, this medallion smells of Sophia and of mud. It doesn't smell of fraud. Elias looked at the captain. You know who had access to that courtyard, Captain? Besides you, the director, and the guards on duty, who else? Moreira hesitated. The cleaning staff, and the pest control crew. There's a rat infestation near the drain. Pest control, Elias repeated the word, thinking aloud. Who's responsible for that? It's an external contract, a company from the city. The employee came yesterday afternoon, a quiet man with glasses. He came in and out without causing any problems. Elias's mind began to work. Sophia's killer was no stranger. It was someone who knew her well, who had access to her home. But who would be audacious enough to break into the prison and plant the evidence, knowing that it would blow up the case? He was taken back to the observation cell, which faced the courtyard. Now he was no longer waiting for death, he was waiting for answers. And he had a feeling that, although the medallion was in prison, the real killer was still outside, watching the mess he had created. But why plant the evidence? Why not just let it disappear? Elias pondered, sitting on the edge of the metal bed. The only reason to plant the evidence at the last minute, in a place that would be discovered by chance, or by a curious dog, was if the killer wanted to cause maximum chaos while simultaneously ensuring the execution was postponed. If the killer wanted Elias dead, the medallion would have remained buried forever. If the killer wanted Elias freed, he would have sent the medallion to the police years ago. The truth was more perverse. The killer wanted Elias to remain imprisoned. He wanted him to remain the culprit, but alive. If Elias died, the case would be closed. If he lived, the investigation would be reopened, and the blame would continue to fall on him, but now under the national spotlight. Elias realized that the assassin wasn't just protecting himself, he was playing the system, and he had just pulled Elias back onto the board 10 minutes before checkmate. The observation cell was small, with a thick glass window overlooking the courtyard. Elias could see the yellow tape, the guards patrolling, and Lieutenant Rodriguez, looking serious, inspecting the drainage hole. The dog, Sombra, was temporarily confined to a makeshift kennel in the corner of the yard. He seemed perfectly happy, lapping water from a metal bowl. Captain Moreira entered the observation cell. He was visibly shaken. Elias, the governor's office is sending in investigators from outside. The case has been reopened, but you remain in custody. You are not free. I know, Captain, but I have a name now. Shadow. And a goal. Moreira sighed. I need to ask you a question, Elias. If you're innocent, how did you know that Sophia's medallion had initials engraved on it? This wasn't disclosed by the police. Elias looked at the captain, the answer simple and painful. Because I loved her, Captain, and I gave her this medallion for her birthday. I even engraved the initials myself. The silence in the cell was louder than any scream. Moreira felt a knot in his stomach. He had walked with an innocent man to his death. Pest control. Who was the employee? Elias asked. A man named Jorge Silva. He has access to all the prison's maintenance records, and he was here yesterday. He had time. Elias closed his eyes, memorizing the name. Jorge Silva, the first name on the list. We have to start with him, Captain. He's the only person who's had unrestricted access to the yard for the last 24 hours, and he knew what to look for. Moreira nodded, picking up his radio. The hunt had begun, and Elias, the man who should have been dead, was now at the center of the investigation, fighting for his life and for Sophia's truth. The clock was ticking, and this time, the deadline wasn't for the execution, but for discovering a killer operating within the shadows of justice. Captain Moreira gripped the radio tightly, cold sweat trickling down the back of his neck. The hunt had begun, but the first difficulty wasn't finding the culprit, it was finding the information. Central. I need all the information about the pest control company that was here yesterday. Employee's name, address, contact phone number. Urgent. He looked at the observation cell. Elias was leaning against the bars, his eyes fixed, unblinking. That man no longer looked like a convict. He looked like a predator that had been released from its cage, focused on a single target. The radio crackled. The voice from Central Station was bureaucratic and slow, the opposite of the urgency Moreira felt. Captain! The employee's name is Jorge Silva. The company address is Rua das Oliveiras, number 40. We tried calling the cell phone number he left on file, but it's out of service. Out of range. Of course it's out of range, grumbled Moreira, hanging up. He returned to his cell. He couldn't officially take on the case, not without an order from the governor, but he felt indebted to Elias. He had almost tied an innocent man to the table. That feeling was worse than years of hard work. Elias, Jorge Silva. The cell phone is off. I already sent a patrol to the company address, but if he's the murderer, he won't be there having coffee. Elias nodded slowly. He's not stupid, Captain. He planted the evidence to suspend the execution. But he didn't want to get caught. He just wanted chaos. He knew the police would focus on me, on my story of innocence, and not on the draining. But why take such a risk? Why plant the evidence inside the prison? Because he couldn't keep her out any longer. Think about it, Captain. 3 years have passed. What has changed? Moreira scratched his head, frustrated. You were going to die. That has changed. Exactly. If I die, the case is closed. The medallion becomes useless. But if he planted it before yesterday, he risked being discovered by cleaners or routine maintenance. He needed a moment that would guarantee maximum impact and the minimum chance of being caught. He waited until the last day, when he had access to the yard. Elias banged on the cell bars. He didn't just plant the medallion, Captain. He planted the discovery. He used the pest control service as cover to get into the yard, plant the evidence, and disappear before the sun rose. At that moment, the execution yard, which was still cordoned off with yellow tape, came to life. 3 unmarked black cars entered through the main gates. The outsiders have arrived, Moreira said, pursing his lips. It's the cabinet's special team. The first to get out of the car was a woman. Tall, thin, wearing a dark grey overcoat despite the mild weather. Her hair was tied in a tight bun, and she had the look of someone who trusted no one. It was Inspector Helena Marquez, known for being ruthless and for closing cases quickly, even if it meant ignoring some details. Helena didn't even look at Director Costa, who was trying to introduce himself. She went straight to the drainage hole, took latex gloves from a pocket, and began inspecting the area. Moreira felt the weight of bureaucracy crashing down on him. He was the prison captain. She was the governor's envoy. He left his cell and approached her, trying to remain calm. Inspector Marquez, Captain Moreira, head of security here. The object has been collected, is sealed and in custody, awaiting forensic examination. Helena stood up without smiling. Her voice was deep and authoritative. Captain, I've already read Director Costa's preliminary report. A security breach, a stray dog, and a convict who conveniently finds the evidence that exonerates him, 10 minutes before his execution. I see this as a staged event, Captain. With all due respect, Inspector, the dog was not trained. And Elias did not have access to the yard. Helena indicated the observation cell with her chin. But he has access to information, doesn't he? He knew what to look for, he knew the initials. And he's trying to manipulate us. He's trying not to die, Inspector. Helena adjusted her overcoat. My priority is to find out if this medallion was planted by Elias or one of his accomplices, to force a suspension. I'm not here to reopen a 3-year-old murder case. I'm here to ensure that justice is served, whatever that may be. Moreira swallowed hard. He knew Helena was there to downplay the scandal, not to uncover the truth. By the way, Captain, where's the dog? The dog, Sombra, is in a makeshift kennel. He is being treated as biological evidence. Helena almost smiled, a quick, cold movement. Biological evidence, great. Keep that creature away from me. And I want to speak to the condemned man, alone. Moreira hesitated, but the order was clear. He opened the cell door, and Elias stood up. Helena entered, closing the door behind her. The smell of metal and disinfectant was strong. She looked Elias up and down. You are Elias. You are convicted of murder. Don't waste my time. My time ran out yesterday, Inspector. Now I have time for the truth. Talk about the medallion, Elias told the story again, about how he had given the jewel to Sophia, about the initials. And you expect me to believe that a mongrel, who happened to break into the most secure prison in the state, unearthed the evidence you needed 10 minutes before your death? I don't expect you to believe me, Inspector. I expect you to investigate. The medallion was covered in mud and a dark substance. I touched it. Helena frowned. What substance? I don't know. But if you're investigating a staged event, you need to know who had access to the courtyard. I already told Captain Moreira. Jorge Silva, Pest Control. He was here yesterday. Helena pulled out a notepad. We're investigating this man, but if you're involved with him, if he's your accomplice, if he were my accomplice, he would have gotten rid of me 3 years ago, not at the last minute. He kept me here, Inspector. He kept me under the shadow of guilt, but pulled me out of the shadow of death. He wants me to continue being the face of the murder while he hides. Inspector Helena showed no emotion, but Elias's logic was disturbing. If Elias were the manipulator, he would have created an escape, not an investigative scandal. Let's analyze the substance. If it's something related to pest control, maybe I'll start taking your story seriously. But, Elias, if you dare to interfere with me, I guarantee the suspension will be revoked, and you'll be back at the table next week. Understood? Elias simply smiled, a smile that was more of a warning than a sign of joy. I understand. But the killer understands me too, and he knows I'm not going to stay quiet anymore. Helena left the cell, calling one of her experts. I want a complete analysis of the medallion, especially the residue. And I want you to examine the drainage with the utmost care. Find something that confirms or refutes Elias's story. As Helena's team began their work, Captain Moreira managed to find a moment to speak with Elias again. He was even paler. Elias, the patrol went to Jorge Silva's company. The place is closed. The neighbor said the company looked abandoned for months. Elias felt a chill down his spine. Abandoned? But he had a contract with the prison. The contract is up to date, but the company, Extermination Rapidly, is a front. There are no trucks, no employees, just a post office box and a tax registration. Jorge Silva falsified everything. He used the identity of a service provider to get himself into prison. The penny dropped for Elias. The killer wasn't an employee. It was someone who knew how the prison security system worked. Someone who knew that Director Costa didn't thoroughly check the small outsourced companies. Captain, he not only planted the evidence, he planted the identity. He's laughing at us. But why? If he's the killer, why would he risk coming in here? He could have sent the medallion anonymously through the mail. Elias approached the glass of the cell, looking at the yellow tape. The anonymous letter would have reopened the case, but it wouldn't have guaranteed that the guilt would remain with me. He wanted the medallion to be found at my moment of death. He wanted the country to see. Elias is innocent, but why was the evidence in prison? He must have an accomplice. He's still involved. He planted doubt, not absolution. Elias thought for a moment about the only person who had cared about him in those last few minutes. And the dog, Captain. Shadow. He must have sniffed the substance. What was it? Moreira gestured to one of his subordinates, asking him to check the status of the expert analysis. The wait was tense. Elias was in the eye of a storm, but now he had control over his mind. He needed more details about Sophia, about what had happened 3 years ago. Captain, I need the files. The original proceedings. What did the police say I did with the medallion? They said you stole it during the fight and threw it into the Red River to get rid of the evidence. They never found it. And what happened to the witnesses? Moreira sighed. There are no direct witnesses, only circumstantial evidence. Your alibi was weak, you owed Sophia money, and you two had a serious argument the night before. I did have an argument with her about money, yes. But I loved her, and the killer knew that. The guard returned with preliminary information, whispering in Moreira's ear. The captain's face hardened. The preliminary expert report from Inspector Marquez has already been released. So then, what was the substance? Moreira looked at Elias through the glass. It's not ordinary mud, Elias. It's a type of granular pesticide for restricted use, mixed with soil. The expert confirmed that it's a product used to kill pests that live in pipes. It's the kind of thing only a pest control company would have on hand, and the smell is very strong. That's why the dog found him, exclaimed Elias. Shadow wasn't sniffing out the metal, Captain. He was sniffing out the poison. The connection was clear. Jorge Silva wasn't just the one who planted the sample. He was the only one with the tool, the smelly pesticide, to ensure the sample was discovered by chance. The plan was brilliant and cruel. Moreira, now convinced of Elias's innocence, knew he had to act quickly before Helena hampered him with bureaucracy. I'll go after Jorge Silva, Elias. I'll use my contacts. But I need something more. Think about Sophia. Think about the killer. Who knew her well enough to know about the medallion? But who would also have access to forged documents and a pest control scheme? Elias closed his eyes, reliving Sophia's last days. The flower shop, the people she knew. Sophia had a fiancé, Elias said, his voice tense. A guy named Daniel Alves. He was jealous, Captain. He didn't like me, not even before I had an affair with her. Daniel Alves. Was he investigated at the time? Yes, but he had a solid alibi. He was on a business trip, working on the day of the murder. He was a sales representative for a large distributor of chemicals and pesticides. Silence returned, but this time it was a silence laden with revelation. Moreira felt his blood run cold. Chemicals and pesticides. Exactly, Captain. Daniel Alves had easy access to restricted-use granular pesticides, and he had the means to create a fake company, a front, to get into prison. Elias remembered something the police never knew about Daniel. Daniel had a strange obsession with cleanliness and order. He was methodical, and he hated when things were out of place. Moreira turned on the radio, ignoring Helena's protocol. Central, I need all the information about Daniel Alves. 3 years ago, he was engaged to Sofia Machado. Address, job, current location. And verify his alibi from the time of the murder. I want confirmation of his place of work. Inspector Helena, who was supervising the collection of soil samples, noticed Moreira's movements. She approached the cell, her face hard. Captain, you're acting on your own. I'm in charge of the investigation now. I'm just following the trail of the substance, Inspector, the pesticide. Daniel Alves worked with that. He was Sofia's fiancé. Helena stopped. Daniel Alves. The name wasn't new to her, but his alibi was considered unbreakable. Daniel Alves' alibi was verified. He was in another city. False, Elias insisted. If he is Jorge Silva, he used his knowledge of logistics and chemistry to orchestrate the hoax. He knew that if the case were reopened, I would be the prime suspect, and he would be the second, and he made sure I was alive to take the blame. Helena looked at Elias with a newfound sense of respect and suspicion. Why would he do that, Elias? Why risk prison to keep you alive but guilty? Because Sofia's death wasn't the end, Inspector. It was the beginning of the game. He wanted me to suffer. He wanted me to live, knowing that the truth was 5 feet away from me and that I would die with the guilt. When he learned of the execution, he realized the game was over. He couldn't allow that. He wanted me to stay here, rotting, knowing that he had won. Moreira's radio started crackling again, the voice of the central station hurriedly calling out. Captain, we found Daniel Alves. He still works at the chemical distribution company, but he's been on medical leave for 2 days. Home address confirmed. And Daniel Alves' photo matches the identification photo that service provider Jorge Silva used to enter the prison. The air in the courtyard grew heavy. The killer wasn't a ghost. He had a name, a face, and an address. And he had been there, inside the prison, less than 24 hours before. Helena snatched the radio from Captain Moreira with a swift movement. Field units, Inspector Marquez speaking. Activate emergency protocol. Daniel Alves is now the prime suspect in the Sofia Machado case. Surround his residence. Do not approach him. I want him alive. He may have more evidence. She looked at Elijah, who was smiling with bitter satisfaction. You're close, Elias. But you're not free. If he's caught and he confesses, the case will be closed. But if he escapes, or if it's a setup, you go back to the holding cell and the clock restarts. Elias walked over to the glass. He had one last piece of the puzzle. Inspector, I need a favor. The dog, Shadow. He smelled the substance. The killer won't have gotten very far without trying to get rid of anything that links him to Jorge Silva. If Daniel Alves escaped, he took the pest control equipment, and Shadow might find it. Helena hesitated. Using a stray dog as a tracker was ridiculous according to protocol, but the urgency was palpable. Captain Moreira, get the dog ready. He's going with the boarding team, and may God help us if he bites one of my men. Moreira, with a glint of excitement in his eyes, went out to carry out the order. The execution yard was empty, but the energy of the investigation was electric. Elias watched the captain go to fetch Sombra. He had been condemned by a love that would kill him. Now he would be saved by the truth, unearthed by a stray dog, and by a murderer who didn't know when to stop playing with his life. The investigation moved to the streets. Prison, which was supposed to be the end for Elias, became the center of his redemption. Captain Moreira found Sombra in the makeshift kennel. The dog, who seemed to have understood everything, wagged his tail vigorously upon seeing Moreira. Okay, Shadow, you're not a police dog, but you're our only chance to get straight to the point. Come on, kid, you're going to smell your own venom again. Moreira and Sombra got into an unmarked car, following Inspector Helena and her team. The city, which was just beginning to wake up, was about to witness the unfolding of a miscarriage of justice that began with a bark at the wrong time. The patrol car sped through the narrow streets, Inspector Helena's radio transmitting the coordinates. Daniel Alves' address was in an upper-middle-class neighborhood with large houses and high walls. A place where discretion was the rule. Upon arrival, the street was already cordoned off by unmarked police cars. Helena stopped the car abruptly and got out, gesturing to her team. Surround the house. No one enters. No one leaves. Moreira, with Sombra in the back seat, opened the door. Sombra jumped out, agitated but focused. Inspector, he needs something to sniff. The medallion is sealed. Helena held out her hand. In her palm was a small plastic bag containing samples of the granular pesticide taken from the drain. Use this, but quickly. Moreira knelt down, letting Sombra sniff the substance. The dog sniffed intensely, its body tense, and then let out a low, sharp bark. It began to pull on the leash, not toward Daniel Alves' house, but to the side, toward a dark alley that led to the back of an abandoned construction materials warehouse. He's not in the house, Inspector, Moreira said, following the dog. He either escaped or is hiding nearby. The smell is strong there. Helena, despite her initial disbelief, went along. The persecution had left the prison and entered the real world. Sombra ran, snout to the ground, dragging Moreira down the alley. The smell of pesticide was the perfect trail. They arrived at the abandoned warehouse. The place was a labyrinth of old planks, torn cement bags, and dust. Sombra stopped near a pile of rubble and began barking frantically, digging with its paws in the damp earth. Inspector Helena and her team drew their weapons, surrounding the area. Daniel Alves! Police! Get out with your hands on your head! There was no answer, only the sound of the wind whistling through the broken windows of the warehouse. Moreira tried to calm Sombra down. What did you think, kid? Ignoring the armed team, Sombra managed to unearth a heavy, dirty canvas bag. Moreira carefully opened the bag. Inside there was no Daniel Alves, but rather Jorge Silva's complete pest control equipment. A sprayer, several bottles of chemicals, and most importantly, a fake identification kit with Daniel Alves' photo and Jorge Silva's name. He got rid of his identity, Helena murmured, but he's not here. Shadow, however, did not stop. He sniffed the bag, let out an even more urgent bark, and ran to a dark corner of the warehouse, where there was a small, rusty metal door. Moreira approached, gun in hand. He could smell not pesticide, but sweat and fear. Daniel, it's over! Get out! Silence was the only answer. Helena gestured to one of her men. Break down the door! The guard gave a powerful kick. The door gave way with a metallic creak. The small room was a makeshift office, cluttered with computers and papers. And there, huddled under a desk, was Daniel Alves. He didn't look like a cold-blooded killer. He resembled a frightened rat, wearing glasses, his face pale and covered in dust. He was holding a small metallic object, and it was trembling. Don't come any closer! I didn't do anything. Elias is to blame. Inspector Helena entered first, her voice firm. Drop what you're holding, Daniel. Daniel, in a desperate move, raised his hand, revealing the object. A small master key, the kind used to open prison maintenance lockers. He was here! He blackmailed me. He made me plant the evidence. Moreira looked at Daniel, then at the key. Did he blackmail you? Daniel, you are Jorge Silva. You planted Sophia's medallion. No. It was Elias. He has accomplices. He knew I had access to the distributor's chemicals. He forced me to falsify my identity. Daniel was lying, but his lie proved that Elijah was right. The murderer wanted the blame to remain on Elijah. Helena took a step forward. Daniel Alves, you are under arrest for the murder of Sofia Machado and for obstruction of justice. While Daniel was being handcuffed and led outside, Sombra, the stray dog, was sniffing the office floor. He stopped near a trash can and began pulling something out. It was a crumpled piece of paper with nervous handwriting. Moreira picked up the paper. It was a draft of a letter written to the prison director. The draft read, I know Elias is innocent. The medallion is in the courtyard. If he dies, I will expose the mistake. The real murderer is... The letter stopped there, torn up. Elias was right. Daniel Alves didn't want him to die. He wanted to use him as a shield. Moreira turned on the radio. Inspector, we have a confession, or at least an intention to confess. He was trying to deflect blame by shifting it to a fictitious accomplice of Elias. In the car, while Daniel Alves was being driven away, Captain Moreira looked at Sombra, who was calmly licking his hand. You saved us, kid. You saved an innocent man. The news traveled fast. Within hours, Elias, still in the prison's observation cell, saw the television on the guard's monitor. The headline was clear. Victim's fiancé arrested as suspect in suspended execution case. Director Costa, humiliated, was forced to sign the transfer papers for Elias to special custody, pending his acquittal. Captain Moreira returned to his cell, not as a jailer, but as a man who had rediscovered his honor. He opened the door. Elias, Daniel Alves is in custody. He's denying it, saying you forced him, but the evidence is overwhelming. The draft of the letter, Jorge Silva's equipment, and the fact that he had access to the pesticide. Elias finally stood up, without the chains on his ankles. And Sofia, Captain, why did he kill her? He confessed when confronted with the medallion. Jealousy. He found out she was in love with you and that she was going to run away with you. He killed her, stole the medallion to frame you, and then used the business trip alibi to clear his name. Elias closed his eyes. The truth was simple and brutal. And why did he come back? Why did he risk everything to keep me alive? Moreira sighed. Daniel Alves didn't want you to die as a martyr. He wanted you to live as a murderer. He wanted you to suffer in prison, knowing he was free and that he had won. The execution would ruin his game. He saved you to continue torturing you. Elias looked out at the courtyard. The sun had finally come out, illuminating the drainage hole. He hadn't counted on Sombra, Captain. Nobody expected Sombra. Elias's story was turning a new page. He was no longer the condemned, but the survivor. What will happen to Sombra? Elias asked. Inspector Helena wanted to send him to animal control, but I intervened. I said he's crucial evidence and needs an official custodian. Moreira smiled, for the first time in years. Director Costa agreed that, for security reasons, the dog should remain in prison under my supervision. He will be the new unofficial patrol dog. Elias laughed. A stray dog patrolling maximum security, it's ironic. Life is ironic, Elias. Captain Moreira led Elias out of the cell. The green corridor seemed different. It was no longer the path to death, but the path to freedom. Elias knew the legal battle would still be long, but he had the medallion and the confession. He was alive, and he had 10 minutes to thank his savior. As he walked through the yard, Elias saw Sombra in the kennel, watching the sun. He approached the fence. Thank you, my friend. You gave me the chance to prove that Sofia's love was real and that my life wasn't a mistake. Sombra wagged its tail and let out a low bark as if to say, Now, let's go home. The prison, however, still held secrets. Daniel Alves was imprisoned, but the system that nearly executed an innocent man remained intact. Elias had survived death, but he still needed to survive justice. And Inspector Helena, though satisfied with the arrest, had a skeptical outlook. She knew that Elias's story was just the tip of the iceberg of a much larger flaw. And she wouldn't stop until she understood how a man, even a convicted one, managed to manipulate the security system of a federal prison. Elias was free, but the investigation into what happened inside the walls was only beginning. He was innocent, but the shadow of doubt still lingered over the ease with which the evidence was planted. The final part of Elias's journey would be proving his innocence in court. But the most dangerous part would be discovering what Daniel Alves was really doing during those 10 minutes in the courtyard, and whether he truly acted alone. There was something more. There was a whiff of conspiracy that the pesticide couldn't mask. Elias sensed it as he left prison. The truth was free, but he wasn't yet. The sound of the iron gate closing was no longer a sound of condemnation for Elias, but rather a sound of promise. Daniel Alves, the real killer, was in custody, and the scandal had exploded in such a way that the state prison seemed to have turned into a circus. Press helicopters hovered over the walls, and the story of a man saved by a stray dog, 10 minutes from death, was headline news across the country. Inspector Helena Marquez, with her cold efficiency, wasted no time. She and her team turned Sofia Machado's case inside out in less than 48 hours. Daniel Alves, confronted with the pesticide trail, Jorge Silva's false identity, and, most importantly, the discovery that he had tried to get rid of all the equipment in the abandoned warehouse, broke down. He didn't confess to Sofia's death immediately, but he did confess the reason for planting the medallion. He wanted Elias to live. I couldn't let him die like an innocent hero, Daniel shouted to Helena from an interrogation room miles away. He had to live the rest of his life knowing that I framed him, that I won. If he died, the suffering would end. The confession was terrifying. It wasn't just jealousy, it was calculated and prolonged evil. Daniel Alves not only killed Sofia, he stole 3 years of Elias's life, almost taking it away completely, just to prolong his own sense of victory. With Daniel's confession, and Sophia's medallion, justice could no longer afford to hesitate. In less than 3 days, the order to suspend the execution was transformed into a release order. Elias was officially exonerated of all charges. He was being transferred to a low-security prison just for the final bureaucratic procedures before being released back into society. Director Costa, embarrassed and with his career ruined, had been forced to take leave, and Captain Moreira was temporarily in charge of security. Moreira came to fetch Elias from the observation cell. This time, he wasn't wearing chains. He was carrying a briefcase full of papers and a clean coat. "Elias, you're free, almost. Just a few more hours of paperwork." Moreira was visibly relieved, but the weight of what had happened still weighed on his shoulders. Elias put on the coat. Feeling the soft fabric, without the musty smell of the prison, was strange. "And Shadow?" Elias asked. "Shadow is in the yard. He's now the most important dog in the state. Inspector Helena tried to take him to be federal evidence, but I said he had an emotional bond with the prison captain. He's safe." They walked down the green corridor one last time. Elias looked at the ground where he had dragged his feet in the darkness, and now he walked in the light. But Elias's mind, which had been forced to work under the pressure of death, wouldn't stop. There was a loose end. "Captain, Daniel Alves is a genius of evil, yes. But he didn't know the prison's security system. He didn't know that the cameras in the maintenance wing were under maintenance. He didn't know that the drainage hole could only be accessed by a service provider. Someone gave him that information." Moreira stopped. He knew Elias was right. Inspector Helena had sensed it too. Helena was already investigating this. She discovered that Daniel Alves, as a sales representative for chemical products, had already visited the prison twice the previous year to try to sell industrial cleaning products for maintenance. "He made contacts," Elias concluded. "He didn't just plant the medallion, he planted the bait." "Exactly. And the bait caught a small fish. Sergeant Ramos," Moreira explained in a low voice. "Ramos was responsible for maintaining the cameras. He had gambling debts. Daniel Alves met him 6 months ago during one of his visits. He didn't ask Ramos to turn off the cameras. He asked Ramos to forget about fixing them, citing a budget problem. In exchange, Daniel paid Ramos's debt, giving him a small bribe in cash and promising more if Ramos helped a friend get a quick pest control job. The truth was disappointing in its pettiness. It wasn't a grand political conspiracy, it was corruption and negligence. Ramos, for a few coins, allowed Daniel, disguised as Jorge Silva, unrestricted access to the execution yard. Ramos was arrested this morning. He confessed to giving Daniel the master key. He thought it was just a nighttime pest control job. He didn't know he was helping to frame a man. Elias sighed. One man's greed had almost cost another man his life. And what about Director Costa? Costa was dismissed. The governor could not afford to keep a director who allowed such a serious security breach and nearly resulted in the execution of an innocent person. The prison will undergo a full audit. They arrived at the main gate. It wasn't the courtyard gate, but the large iron exit that led to the world outside. The sun was shining brightly. A car awaited them, a black sedan sent by the governor's office to ensure Elias's discreet departure. Next to the car, waiting, was Inspector Helena Marquez. She didn't seem any less tense, but there was a sense of recognition in her eyes. "Elias, the acquittal process will be quick. You will be entitled to compensation, but that's a matter for your lawyers." Elias nodded. "Inspector, thank you for taking what Captain Moreira said seriously. I took the evidence seriously, the pesticide, the dog story, and your logic. Daniel Alves underestimated the intelligence of all of us, and especially your own. He wanted you to live to suffer, but you used the life he gave you to bring him down." Helena paused. "I don't believe in miracles, Elias, but that dog, he was in the right place at the right time. His name is Shadow, Inspector, and he's not a miracle. He's proof that the truth, even when buried, always has a scent strong enough to be sniffed out." At that moment, Captain Moreira appeared, holding a leash. At the end of the leash was Sombra. The mongrel, who seemed to have gained a little weight in recent days, had his fur brushed and his tail wagging expectantly. "He came to say goodbye," Moreira said, his voice choked with emotion. "He's my service dog now, Elias, but I know he has a real owner." Sombra ran to Elias, jumping and barking softly, a display of joy that Elias hadn't seen in years. He crouched down, hugging the dog. Sombra smelled of earth, of life, of freedom. "You're a good kid, Sombra. You gave me 10 minutes, and those 10 minutes turned into a lifetime." Elias stood up, looking at Moreira, Captain, I have nothing. But when I get my life back, I'll come back for you. Moreira smiled, a genuine smile. He will be here, Elias. Waiting. Inspector Helena hurried Elias to the car. The driver opened the door, and before getting in, Elias took one last look at the prison. Not with hatred, but with the certainty that he was closing that chapter. He got into the car. The vehicle began to move away from the tall gates. He looked out the rear window. Captain Moreira was standing there, holding Sombra's leash, who was sitting next to him, watching the car drive away. Inspector Helena, sitting next to him, picked up her cell phone to make a call. Daniel Alves is in jail. Ramos is in prison. Sofia Machado's case is solved. She looked at Elias. Now the hardest part begins, living. Elias looked out onto the street, at the people walking freely, without chains. He was free, but he was not the same Elias who had entered prison. He was a survivor. I'm going to turn things around, Inspector. I'm going to honor the life Sombra gave me. And then, suddenly, he remembered a detail. Inspector, when Daniel Alves was being taken from the storage room, he was holding a master key, the key to the maintenance cabinet. Yes, the key that Ramos gave him. But he said I blackmailed him, that I forced him to plant the evidence. He was trying to frame a fictitious accomplice. Helena nodded. What he didn't know, Elias continued, his gaze drifting into the distance as the city stretched past the window, is that the key was his, but the idea of using it against me was already in his head. He had the key. He had the pesticide. He had the plan. Elias smiled, understanding the depth of Daniel's evil. He not only framed me for Sofia's death, Inspector, he planned the execution. He made sure I was on death row so his game would be perfect. He just didn't expect the smell of poison to be stronger than his thirst for blood. The car sped away, leaving the prison walls behind. Elias, the man who had 10 minutes to die, had just been given his life back. And he knew that somewhere, a stray dog was waiting for him, guarding the truth. Justice sometimes didn't come from the courts, but from a hoarse bark at the exact moment when time was about to run out. The darkness had been exposed, and Elias was finally back in the light.